This works, so that's fine.
It's fly, but it kind of looks like a cursor.
No, I should point out.
We just keep to the arrows, yeah.
Right.
We say hello to the people who are here first.
All right, good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. We are broadcasting live, whatever that means, so. Thanks so much for joining our early morning session. If you're not a morning person, I'm sure this is fairly brutal, so thanks for joining.
I am not a morning person.
That's why he's there.
I'm at the table, she's over there. If it were midnight, this would be all me. So.
Yeah, let's do it. I would do that. So we're here. I'll just introduce myself very quickly. My name is Alexandra Campbell Ferrari. I'm the executive director and co-founder of the Center for Water Security and Cooperation. We are both lawyers. I'll get to you. We're both water lawyers, and we work on essentially ensuring that water law guarantees water security and universal access to water and sanitation. So one of the things that I'll talk about is that, oftentimes the focus is on technology, but we focus on the law, which is that soft infrastructure that is equally as important as, as all of that hard infrastructure that you typically see or can see and talk about.
I'm Luke Wilson. I'm the deputy director and co-founder of the CWS.
Okay, and the resident jokester. So any funny stuff's gonna be coming from him.
Careful.
So today we're here to talk about the American Water Access Survey. And one of the things I want to say up front, a lot of these conferences focus on international issues. And one of the things that we forget is that we have a lot of water and sanitation issues here in the United States as well. And it's actually underreported and under talked about and really underappreciated. And for all the work that the United States and USAID does abroad, we have a lot of work to do here at home. The other thing I'll say as well is that in addition to it being applicable to the United States, it also applies to any of the other countries that, any other country. So we work in a lot of other countries, including countries across Africa, Latin America, and then also the United States. And this could be similarly applied there. We've developed a similar benchmark that we use in the international context, but I think that's important to note that it does, in our presentation, will focus on the United States today, but it does apply internationally. So we have three objectives today. The first is to just share this tool, talk about how we created it, why we created it, and what it actually does, and why it's not just a passive tool that will sit on the bookshelf and not be used or not be important. The second is to get your feedback, right? We're going to actually ask you some questions. There's going to be some participation, so you can't fall asleep in the back. I will be watching you, and you will have to talk. So the other bad thing is that we're both professors as well. We both teach at law school, so we're very accustomed to using the Socratic method, if you've ever heard of that. So calling you out, but don't worry, it's all in good spirit. And then the last thing is that if you work for really any nonprofit, any community action agency, any stakeholder in this sector, then we're going to be trying to recruit you to participate in our next iteration of this, whether it be in the United States or internationally. So I like to start with a little bit of context. The first thing is that across the world, 1 in 4 people do not have access to safely managed water and sanitation. Right, it's 2022, and I have to keep reminding myself of that. Even working in this sector, it's really easy to forget these numbers, right? This is a significant issue, right? Water is the most basic thing we have, yet 1 in 4 people do not have access to safely managed, and that means drinkable, safe drinking water in their homes. It's even worse for sanitation, right? Nearly half of the population doesn't have safely managed sanitation. So that means your untreated fecal waste is just streaming into our rivers and lakes. In the United States, 2.2 million people live without running water and basic plumbing. So 2.2 million in the United States are still living without access to plumbing, both from a water and a sanitation perspective. And then on top of that, right, those are just the numbers of people who don't have all that hard infrastructure I'm talking about. There's other people who are under threat of losing access because of water affordability issues, water scarcity, so droughts, and then water quality issues. So we have Flint, we have Jackson, Mississippi. We have a number of examples of how people have lost access because of the water quality issues. On top of that, we have very few laws across the United States, let alone the entire world, that actually generate a system and structure that prioritizes access to drinking water, that makes it a responsibility, and that forces us to actually achieve the human right to water and sanitation. And then lastly, to set up the work that we're doing in part, is that there are very few mechanisms to actually track this, right? So we talk about the SDGs, but in terms of actually understanding the durability of our access to water and sanitation, we don't understand it. We don't have a mechanism to track this over time, especially from the law and policy angle. So we can't know what's actually happening, right? We don't know how weak or strong the laws are, if they're being implemented, if they're being enforced, and if they're having the desired impact. So back in 2017, we said, okay, we see this water crisis happening. We're not entirely sure what it looks like. We know that the laws are at issue here. So let's start with looking at the state of Maryland. So we're based in Washington, D.C., so we wanted to look at something that was in our own backyard. So we did an extensive study looking at essentially 200 different jurisdictions at the local level, because that's where the laws are actually made that govern our water and sanitation largely. And essentially what we found is that there is no definition for access. So when we talk about access, I can almost guarantee you that every single one of us uses a different term. We all have a very different understanding of what that means, not just now, but even over time, right? So it's currently meeting or currently achieving access to water, and then over time achieving access to water. The second thing is that, the law isn't helping us. We do not have a legal infrastructure that is creating the kind of support structure we need to actually achieve our access to water and sanitation, not just this elusive idea of a human right to water and sanitation, but actually achieving and making sure that every single human being has access to water and sanitation. And then the last thing is that, law is at the heart of this. Law creates that foundation, it creates the rights and responsibilities and that structure of accountability and transparency that we need. And the power of it is that we write the law. As human beings, we write the law. We can change the law. Unlike in terms of, particular scientific principles like gravity, right? We can't really change gravity. It's here. We can, there are other scientific principles as well, right? If the water is dirty, it's dirty, right? You can clean it, but it is still dirty. But the law, we are writing those words. We make the choices of what goes into the law and how we write it. So we can change it. And the same with the policy. We choose those policies, we choose those visionary statements. We can rewrite that policy. We can reprioritize our commitment to water and sanitation. So the first thing we did after finishing this Maryland report was sit down and actually say, okay, well, how do we define this concept of access, right? How do we get everybody on the same page that we're working together, that we're trying to achieve the same thing? And so we said, look, access to water is having in-home, reliable availability of sufficient water to meet domestic needs safely. A lot packed into that, right? It still is fairly meaningless. I mean, you can understand the terms, but again, you and I could sit down and debate what each of those terms mean. But that was a starting point for us. We needed to set a framing for the work that we were going to be doing moving forward. And so we created this more, I would say, measurable standard. And at the top of it is equity, right? If we don't all have access to water, someone is being left out of achieving access to water because of their gender, their race, their culture, their ethnicity, whatever it is, then we're failing everybody, right? Everybody deserves to have access to this, and everybody's need for water and sanitation doesn't change because of any of those principles. Second, there are these two aspects of access. There's the physical aspect where you need sufficient water resources of sufficient quality. You need the actual infrastructure to deliver that water and sanitation to your home. And then you need a good quality water service and a good quality sanitation service that protects public health and the environment, right? That's physical access. But you can't forget about this economic access idea, right? There's millions, if not billions of people across the world who can't afford this. Either they can't afford to pay their water bills, which we'll talk about in the United States context, or they can't afford to bring those water and sanitation services to their home, right? They can't afford to have a well drilled. They can't afford to have a pit latrine built or a sanitation system constructed, right? They don't have the financial resources, and they also deserve to be protected. And so this idea of economic access is that you should still have access to water despite your inability to pay for these services. And that's important to remember. So it was with this framing that we went forward and did and created the American Water Access Survey. And we took off one piece of that, right? And actually in our next stage, we'll be taking on every piece of that. But we started with this idea of economic access in large part because of the fact that there was significant reporting around the world and in the United States about how people couldn't afford their water bills, that people were being shut off, that people were being denied access to water because they simply couldn't pay for it. And then on top of that, we also knew that there were very limited resources to help you pay for it. So if I can't pay for it, I have really no recourse to help me, unless I went to some kind of other social service, which doesn't necessarily guarantee that, they might bring you a pallet of water, but they won't necessarily pay for your water bill. So there were two things that we looked at. We looked at the laws written. So what are the words on the page, right? What does it look like? What is allowed? What is not allowed? Who has the authority to do what, right? The basic infrastructure that is guiding all the decision making and all the actions and activities that we take. And then on the other end, we also looked at the law and practice, right? Because words are words, they are powerful, but they also require action to be meaningful. And so we looked at the law and practice in terms of, well, what is actually being done? How is the law being implemented? Is it being implemented? Is it being enforced? What is the impact of the law? Is it achieving the goals that you've actually laid out or not? So it's both this, this American Water Access Survey both sets a standard and serves as a diagnostic and a tracker, right? So the idea is we're saying, here's how you define access to water, and here's what we would expect to find in the laws and expect to find in practice, in addition to being something that we can use to say, okay, well, this is how it's either improving or it's not improving over time. So I take a step back here because, again, you can still be asking yourself, well, again, isn't the best thing that we can do just drill a well, right? Drill a well, bring the water, just get it done. But at the heart of that is that for certain things, it just isn't a holistic solution, right? Even if you drill that well can be overused. It can be captured by certain parties. It can be contaminated, right? You need rules in place to protect the things that you do. And since we're focusing in on economic access, this is the example I typically use, right? So let's say you have a water bill. You've received a water bill, you're a low-income household. You just don't have the money to pay it, right? You can't pay that month. You paid your rent, you paid other things, electricity bills, your car bill, because you need a car to get to work. You have no other money. Well, under the law can decide, okay, well, we're not allowed to shut off water to that family. We can't punish them for being poor. Or the law can say, yes, we have this blanket acceptance of water shut off. So if you don't pay your bill, you don't get access to water, just plain and simple. So that's the power of the law. Your income deserved, it determines whether or not you can pay or not. But it's the law that actually says, okay, we can change the course of what happens once you don't have that money to pay. And that's the power of law. I think that's one of the best examples of how powerful the law can be. So it can literally change your outcome and your service level if you are a low-income household. So this is part of what the access survey looks like. And there's a number of criteria. This is just a sample of them. But the idea here is that we identified a criteria or an indicator. So for example, we looked at whether or not water shutoffs were permitted or actually forbidden based on non-payment. And then we had different levels of what were we expecting to find in the law. And then we graded them, right? But we used a color system for now. We may decide to change that in the future, but we used a color system that's kind of simple to understand. So you can see here that with the red, that's not the good solution, right? So water shutoff is allowed. There's no consideration of income. If you're low income and you can't pay, the law just doesn't consider that. To put it in simple terms, that's the bad option, the red option. When you see the orange, okay, it's not ideal, right? So it says a water shutoff is allowed, but only if rate assistance is offered or only if a payment plan is offered. At least something has to be offered before the water shutoff can take place. So it's not an ideal situation because you could still be subject to a water shutoff, but we're going to give credit to a utility that at least tries to do something. And then green, or the law, when the law does something. In the green, the water shutoff is actually prohibited by law against low-income households. That's the best option. Again, not allowing for low-income households to be punished for being a low-income poor community. That is the ideal standard for that criteria. And then there's a number of other criteria that we also looked at, like shut off notices, how long you have between not paying your bill and a shut off, disconnection fees, reconnection fees, whether or not they can become a lien. So whether or not you could actually wind up losing your house because of an unpaid water bill, which does happen and is allowed. And then also the reporting. So one of the things we also looked at is, well, do utilities have to, under the law, actually report this information? And we'll talk about whether that's the case. So these are some of the criteria for the law as written. And then in terms of what we looked at state law and municipal law. So this is really a local issue, which is why you have to look at local law. And this is, it's like, it's been devolved from the federal level to the state, and the state also washes their hands of it for the most part, which is also part of the problem, is that you can have, 20, like in Maryland, for example, you can have 200 jurisdictions. In the state of Maryland, that tiny little state, you can have 200 different iterations of what can happen to you when you can't pay your water bill. And then I also talked about the law and practice. So here we have the law and practice. What is actually allowed, right? What happens? Have the utilities in fact executed a water shut off? So the law can allow it, but the utility can actually have a different policy or practice that says, hey, we're not going to do that. Or it says, yes, we are. Are late fees actually charged? We have this thing where we look at whether or not it's pegged to the cost. So we talk about disconnection fees and reconnection fees as being poverty penalties. Essentially, it is a penalty for being too poor to be able to pay. So you pay interest, late fees, disconnection fees, reconnection fees, all of these fees. When it comes to at least a disconnection and a reconnection, if it's pegged to the cost, there's some rationale behind it. I mean, it's not a good rationale because just, again, you don't have to roll that truck out to disconnect the water, but at least there's a fee associated with it or a cost associated with it that you're charging to them. Not a great option, again, why it's in orange, but at least it has a rationale other than we're just penalizing you for being too poor to pay. So for this, we looked at utility websites, we looked at the policies and regulations adopted by the utility as a result of what the law allows. We looked at, we also surveyed the utility, so we had a questionnaire that we asked them to complete. And then we also had household surveys. So we worked with community action agencies, which in the United States are kind of like quasi-governmental entities that are given money to support low-income families. So they deal with electricity, they deal with water, they deal with a whole range of different social services. So this is just a sample of some of the questionnaires too. So when we were talking to utilities, we asked them, are water services shut off for water leakage and water wastage? Another dimension of this. So if your water's leaking and you have like $1,000 bill and you're a low-income household and you can't pay to fix it, your water can be shut off. So there's a lot of penalties associated with being low income. We looked at whether or not customers have arrearages, right? How many customers have arrearages? We looked at what is the range low to high of those household arrearages. Some of this is a little hard to see, so I apologize for that. We also looked at the average household arrearage amount. So how much money does the average household still owe to the water utility? And then another one. Oh, how long do people typically have their water shut off for, right? Just to give us a sense. And the reason we had to do these questionnaires is because this information isn't public. It isn't out there. So we don't even know what's happening and we have to ask them, which is part of one of the things that we've been working on. The household survey. So we also talk to households because they're often left out of this conversation. The very households who are subject to these rules and struggling to pay and keep access to water are not part of the conversations in terms of, well, how are these laws and policies impacting me and how do we fix the problem? So we asked if their water had been shut off. We looked at 2019, 2020, and 2021. So pre-pandemic and then during the pandemic, the longest time your water had been shut off. And then one of the other things we looked at and we asked about was, besides where you get your water when your water is shut off, and then how you felt when your water was shut off, right? To get a sense of the physical and mental impact on you. But we asked, how do you choose, what is the order of the bills that you pay, right? So, how are you choosing and what is that order of those bills? So electricity, heat, internet, water, rent, your cell phone, health insurance, car payment. And you might ask yourself, well, car payment, phone, these are luxuries. For people, they're often not, right? A phone is how they get a job. That's how they earn income. A car is how they get to their work. In a lot of communities, you can't afford to live in the city. And even if you could, you still need a car to get to your job, right? So some of these are not, they're not luxury expenditures. So we asked them, how do you order that?
Sorry,
Yeah.
just to highlight one point from the previous slide.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that we asked as well was, how did you feel when your water was shut off? And really trying to get a sense, not leaving it a very open-ended question, but giving people an opportunity to say, here is what the impact was on me mentally, physically, here's what I did, here's how I dealt with it. Because the sort of mental health component to this is something that's very underreported. I mean, and it's hard to sort of identify what impact that has down the line. When you lose access to water, do you feel unclean? You can't go to work. You don't want to go to work. You think you the same thing for kids. You don't want to send your kids to school if they can't be clean. I mean, these are things that are often not really talked about. So we wanted to make sure that we brought that into the discussion in particular.
Yeah. And it's an incredibly important dimension to all of this as well. And there is an economic cost. So if you're an economist, there still is an economic cost to all of this. Some additional, we also threw in, do you believe your drinking water is safe to drink? We're just kind of curious, right? We just wanted to kind of use it as a bellwether of, how is that part of the reason maybe they're not paying, or even if they do pay, do they still use it, or do they have to buy alternative water? So we worked in 6 cities. We worked in Cleveland, Detroit, El Paso, Richmond, Shreveport, and St. Louis. So it pretty much covers all of the United States. The West is not well represented, but we go as far over as El Paso, Texas. And the idea was that we chose cities who had a significantly larger community or larger percentage of their community who was living below 150% of the federal poverty line. We took communities that were, there was a larger group of BIPOC community members. And then also we chose a population size between 100,000 and 750. So not super big, but not super small. And we asked each of the utilities to complete a survey, and then we also collaborated, as I said, with local community action agencies. This was the result. And I think it largely speaks for itself, though I will talk through some of it, but it's red. And it's red because the law does a really, I'll just put it in the simplest terms, it did a really crappy job. As a lawyer, this is really disappointing. This is why I became a lawyer, because our law should provide those protections. Our law should prioritize human health and existence, and they don't. They are literally, they literally either don't say anything, right? I mean, the number of times you see not stated, there are no protections provided here. The law doesn't say anything. And what it does is it leaves it to the utility to decide. And I think there's a question there, right? There's a lot of people that say, well, they're the best in the best position, not for policy questions. These are not about utility operation. This is about decisions we make and how we prioritize human health, human existence, just in general. And so I think the thing that I'm almost most disappointed about is the not stated part. The fact that there are things not stated in the law, that the law says nothing about, is there a limit on an interest fee? Is there a limit on a reconnection fee? Are there limits on this so that people are protected? They're not just charged exorbitant fees or unjustified fees for not being able to pay for their water bill. And again, all of this conversation is focused on low-income households, right? So if you're a wealthy, and this happens, right? I can't remember the guy's name, and the guy from Magnum PI.
Tom Selleck.
Yeah, so Tom Selleck, right? He's a great example. When the drought a couple of years ago was happening, right? He flouted all the rules, and he's had to pay thousands of dollars in fines, but he used whatever water he wanted to use, right? So if you're wealthy, these don't apply to you, right? Because you should be able to pay your water bill. But we were talking about low-income families who don't have the economic resources to do that. So, again, for me, the not stated is the most disappointing aspect of this. The other aspect is that even where there's not stated, it's either no or yes where it should be, and then there's not required. So formal water shut-off policy in terms of actually having a written statement that says, here's what could happen if your water is shut off. Doesn't have to be written up. It's not required. A utility doesn't necessarily have to tell you what their policy is. And what you find is that, so here's a good example. When we talked to a utility in Maryland, this was under our first report, we asked, well, what is your process for shutting off water? How do you go about doing that? They essentially said that they choose the communities that have the most water shut off. So the part of the communities where there's the most number of households that need to be shut off. Because that's where they can make the most money, right? And it's not intentionally biased. I don't think they had even thought of what that means, right? Because you're always going into the part of the community that, of course, there's the greater number of people that can't afford it, right? That's where all those numbers are going to start to pop up. But that's the policy. It's about money. And so this is why the law matters so much, is because it sets the baseline for what we expect from human beings, essentially. So then we also looked at the law as practice. And this gives you a little bit of hope, right? Because there's some green in here and there's some orange, but you can see that the utilities themselves are at least doing some things well. And you can see that for most of the communities, they offer rate assistance of some kind. Now, the downside, and this is one thing that I highlight because we did not parse out the rate assistance programs, but a lot of the rate assistance programs are largely ineffective. And they're ineffective because they either don't give enough assistance, so it's like some kind of basic number that's given, $10 a month, which may or may not actually help you. The second thing is that enrollment rates in rate assistance programs are really low in most communities. So most communities, most people don't even enroll in them. Either they don't know they exist, or there's a tremendous amount of paperwork that you have to complete in order to apply for it. But it is at least offered, so there's a green mark there. In terms of interest, most communities actually do not charge interest rates on late bills, which is a good thing. We saw that more in Maryland. Late fees are kind of yes and no. Disconnection fees are often not, at least in Cleveland, they are not charged, but that could and was subject to change. Reconnection fees are the same, but oftentimes those fees are not pegged to a cost. So they are an actual, cost that is incurred by the utility. Reconnection terms, those are not particularly transparent. So, and non-existent really. So in terms of, largely what you have to do is pay everything that you ever owed and or establish a payment plan. Water shut-off policies, you can see that most don't have them. The number of water shut-offs that's actually executed is not published. So there's a lot of issues here. The one thing is that utilities have a website. And again, we don't get into the quality of those websites, but they're not great. So what are some of the broader conclusions? I mean, first and foremost, all 6 utilities actually allow for water to be shut off. And that's a problem against low-income households. Without any kind of barriers, guardrails, protections, that is an underlying fundamental issue that the law doesn't address and needs to address. In terms of fees, at least one fee is allowed to be charged. And not only that, those fees are not talked about in the law. So there's no limitations on what can be charged. There's no limitation or protections put in place. Liens, that was not in the chart that I put, but liens can be in 3 of the utilities. They can submit those unpaid water bills to become a lien on your house. And those liens mean that your house can be foreclosed upon. So a low-income household who's already dealing with payment issues, already doesn't have enough money, can even become more unstable and wind up losing their home, right? That does no one any good. So that's a significant issue. The law doesn't require utilities to offer payment plans or rate assistance. Again, a failure of the law. One of the other things that we looked at was this idea of ring fencing. So we talked a lot about, or at least in the utility space, there's a lot of discussion about, well, do utilities have the sufficient resources to actually do their jobs well? And what you find is that in many communities, all that revenue that you pay to get your water and sanitation services isn't necessarily set aside specifically for the utility. It can actually be thrown into a general fund and used to fund education and other expenses. Now, that's all well and good, right? It's not to say that education isn't important, but you also have to pay for your infrastructure. So if your infrastructure and your water and sanitation system is failing, that also is an anchor institution. And without that, a community would also fail. So you have an issue with money getting diverted from revenue getting diverted from the utility into the general revenue budget. And then lastly, to be honest, the amount of information that is available is atrocious. When you look at the public documents and what is actually publicly available, it is incredibly difficult to find this information. And I have the time to do that, but families don't have the time. If they need to know, look, I can't pay this bill. What am I going to be subject to? What penalties am I going to be subject to? They can't find that. And a lot of that information was in the law. And most people, and even to find the municipal codes is quite difficult. So if you can find the municipal codes, you then have to find which provision deals with it, and then you have to read that legal language, which honestly is oftentimes very, very difficult to understand. So this information has to be made more public, which moves into, before I talk about recommendations, I take a second to give some space for the voice of the households that we talk to, right? This is a very real problem for them. It has a significant impact on their mental and physical health. And they talked about that in their survey responses to us. And many of those households have children, and they worry and stress about the impact on the health of their children, either being exposed to water that they don't feel is safe, or in terms of not having access to sufficient water, right? Having to use bottled water instead. The other thing that I point out and that I appreciated hearing and that made me a little sad was, they said, thank you for reaching out. Thank you for actually talking to us, because one of the things that we forget about in this sector is that there are people who are subject to these laws and policies. And we need to ask them, we need to think ourselves as people who are also subject to those laws and policies, is this what we want? Because as I said in the beginning, we write those laws, we can change those laws. So we are subject to them. And that's why law, even though it's political, and even if you hate politics, is why it's so important for you to be involved in these conversations, especially in the water sector. But like I said, I like to give some space to those households because this is a very real issue. And we need to remember who we're fighting for when we think about these laws and policies and we make recommendations. So I won't spend too much time on these, but because I want to get to the discussion, but some of those recommendations include, first and foremost, we have to know who is losing access to water. There is no, in the United States, let alone across the world, there is no system in which we say, okay, how many people are losing access to water? Utilities are not required to report this data. We need that kind of transparency so we can fix the problem, right? You can't fix a problem you don't really know or understand. You also can't hold people accountable when you don't know what they're doing. And so that's why we also need to have all of this information, not just the actual shutoffs, but the law and policy information to be more transparent and accessible for people. Second, for me, until there's a better solution, and we have a question about that today, water shutoffs against low-income households should just be prohibited. Until we have some kind of solution, it just doesn't make sense. There is no alternative. You cannot deny people who cannot pay access to water and sanitation. It's 2022. They're human beings just like everybody else. Their need for this doesn't go away. We need to ensure that they have those protections. And the last thing that I'll kind of pull out from this is the fees as well, right? The poverty penalties are just atrocious. We also need to get rid of those. Those penalties do nothing but punish you for being poor. They put you even further into the hole, and that's not helpful. That's not good law, and it's not good policy. So what are we doing all with this information, and how do we think that you can be part of this? Because that's a really critical part for us, is that we work with a lot of partners. We work with a lot of local partners, we work with households, and you and they are critical to the success of this. So one thing is that we're working to increase the visibility. So we're working in those 6 cities to talk about the results and actually get action on those results. We're revising the benchmark, right? We're thinking, okay, are there other things that we should be collecting on? Is there more information that we should be collecting? Should it be conveyed differently? Things like that. And you can be a part of that. You can work with us to review that and say, hey, based on my expertise, I would also consider reviewing and including A, B, and C, right? Building out the remaining parts, because even though we focus on economic access, the physical access component, and whether or not there's sufficient water resources, whether or not the water is actually drinkable, those are also all feeding into the success of, or the achievement of access to water. Because if you can't drink your water, you don't have access to water. And so we're building out that part right now. And if you have thoughts about that, we welcome that as well based on your expertise. And then the last thing is that we want to work with more communities. So we're seeking to work with more communities. If you have a community in mind, either you work with or you live in, either one, we'd love to work with that community. So please feel free to reach out to us and say, hey, work here and here's why, and I can help you to connect or talk to these certain people. I also wanted to say that because it's a tool, we don't always talk about the action. Well, this has spurred a tremendous amount of action. So in Texas, what happened, our local community action agency within El Paso connected us with the Texas Association for Community Action Agencies, and we were working with them to propose a water data act with State Representative Thompson's office. So in that data act, it will require water utilities and wastewater utilities to report certain data in terms of water shutoffs and other things. It's a more limited list, but at least there will be certain information that has to be reported by utilities if passed. So that will be proposed in the January 2023 session. In Maryland, we're working with State Senator Lamb to propose a similar water data act. It's more extensive. So the politics in Texas are a little bit different. Politics in Maryland, we'll see what actually gets passed, hopefully, not would. But there's a huge laundry list of things on the Water Data Act in Maryland that we are requesting utilities to report on. And this is all data that they already have. So it shouldn't be that heavy of a lift, and that's why we feel like it should be successful. In Michigan, we're working with a group called We the People of Detroit to ensure an implementation of a 2-year rate assistance program that was adopted by DWSD. In not the best of ways, but we're helping We the People to actually draft some legislation that would create something more permanent, again, based on the work that we did on the Outlaws. And then we also have other groups that we're working with in other states. So I do this not to brag, but to say this actually does, we talk a lot about tools, they wind up on the shelf, they seem really inactive, ineffective, kind of boring. But this actually does prompt people to work, to ask questions, to say, hey, we should change our laws. Hey, wow, I actually know what needs to change because we have data and information about it. So that's important to us. And that's why we will continue doing this work, because it actually has led to change. Like I said earlier, so we work internationally as well, and we're taking it internationally. So we work with a number of countries at the national level to draft new water laws. And so we've adopted a similar metric, similar idea. It looks a little bit different because we're talking about a national water law, but it's very similar that we used to assess and diagnose issues in national water laws and then help to rewrite those laws. So we've been working with South Sudan and El Salvador to write their first water law, and also with the community CSO and Zambia to revise their existing water laws. And so again, the idea is that these tools actually can be beneficial, and that's exciting for us. So that's the end of the presentation. Well, I will leave some time for questions, but we also have like a participation aspect as well. So, and Luke, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Well, let's see what the questions are.
Okay. So any questions? Oh, there's a lot of information. Hi, well.
Yeah, let's see, how are you?
Good.
Sorry, we're late. I had a question when it comes to have you been able to interact or liaison with like American Water Works Association or WEF or any of the other like more utility focused, water, large professional organizations?
Yeah, so a great question. We do liaison with them. We haven't with them on this. So they've I've been part of some of their panel discussions on the financial capability assessment, some very US focused things. But we haven't necessarily talked about this with them yet, but they're on the list.
Hi, Abby Bradshaw, were you able to get any idea of how COVID affected some of these things? I mean, just thinking in terms of, I know some utilities in some cities gave more leniency. Did you see any, I don't know, did you see anything interesting happening in terms of that? Because I think there was a lot of people who did get some welcome leeway, and then after that, it was sort of like a shock back into reality, or back into the silly reality of shutoffs and things.
Yeah, the status quo, absolutely. Yeah, a great question. So in addition to this work, we were tracking the implementation of the Low-Income Household Water Assistance Program, which is a national program that provided emergency rate assistance. Although it hasn't really been rolled out particularly effectively. But setting that aside, in addition to that, we did track some of those moratoriums as well at the state level and at the local level. Largely, most states did not adopt a statewide water shutoff moratorium. Where they did, they were for a very short period of time. And the local municipalities will also, they would adopt a water shut off moratorium, but also for a very short period of time. So there was a sense that there was some kind of let up a little bit, but no, I'm not sure that I saw the impact, at least in the survey results. Luke, did you see anything there?
Not exactly. I mean, definitely in the law as practiced, I think is
Yeah.
where there were some, I mean, we always tried to collect information, you know, is this a new policy? Is this a COVID policy? And tried to get sort of the basic rule that existed, what the utility was doing normally.
Yeah.
And then from that, and so that was the data that we collected for the most part, as opposed to sort of emergency. Emergency
I think
response.
that's a good point too. So for Cleveland, because the Cleveland utility didn't participate in our survey, they're under litigation right now, so their lawyer advised them not to. But we called the customer service hotline, and so the reason it was all green was primarily because the customer service agent said that they were not being charged, but that was subject to change.
Oh.
And it didn't necessarily sound like a COVID policy, because I also asked that, but it just seemed, it was kind of unclear.
Yeah.
But she did say it could change. So I think that was probably the closest I got to an indicator that there were some shifts, but otherwise, no.
Well, I think this also highlights the issues with the transparency of the data and sort of the ineffectiveness of some websites is that the information is not, like, you're getting it orally from a customer service rep. So it might change if you call another customer service rep, and that can be really difficult, particularly if you're trying to get some sort of resolution to a bill issue.
Yeah,
So-
or even just to say like, how long am I gonna be able to not pay, you know, or like how long
Sure.
am I gonna be able to this on, whatever, thank you.
Thank you. I think your hand was up.
Have you talked to any like private providers of water, say like American Water for best practices that, you know, how do they deal with this situation? And do they have fewer shut off than even with the dollar focus that a private or, you know, public company like that might have? Is there best practices that they're doing that can be incorporated within municipalities too?
Sure. Another really good question. So we focused on public utilities. And we did not include a private utility, and we would like to in the future. I would say that from some of our other work, I don't necessarily get the sense that private utilities necessarily have better practices. So one of the things in the United States, you often have state public utility commissions that oversee private utilities. And there's a sense that because there's a public utility commission, there's greater oversight of private companies. There largely isn't. The only oversight that they provide is on the rate structure. So there's arguably more protection in terms of the rate structures. And you could probably find data to suggest that, you know, there's a lot of discussion about how private utilities charge more for services, but I think it's largely because it actually reflects the cost of providing those services because of the Public Utility Commission regulations. But otherwise, those public utility commissions don't provide any oversight of any of these other things. So I would expect to find similar, kind of similar policies. Their communications might be better because there's more resources for that, but I like in a good way. I mean, they may actually be able to have a higher enrollment rate in a rate assistance program, and they may have more funding for a rate assistance program. Some of those are all kind of guesses, but.
Yeah, we did actually in the original, we focused on the communities primarily, so we chose the cities. And then we looked, and then it just so happened that most of them were public, actually all of the ones that we ended up working with were public utilities. We did actually have Bakersfield, California in the mix initially. And that is served by a private utility by California Water. And it was interesting because getting information from them was a lot more difficult. Because there isn't the same sort of governmental accountability, there aren't multiple avenues to go through. So getting them, we worked with them and tried to negotiate them filling out the survey, and in the end, it just didn't go anywhere. And in Cleveland, it was the same thing, but it's because they're being sued.
On these issues.
On these issues, exactly. But with the private utility, it was much harder to get them to, there was no willingness, really, there's no sense that was a responsibility they had to. So I think that's where you might, I think American Water is a better company in that sense, perhaps. But I think that's one of the drawbacks from working with the private utilities. The data, it's a lot harder to force that data, which you can with public utilities.
Yeah, there's also, I will say one thing that I thought was interesting is that I worked with them for a while to try to get them to share that data. And they asked me, well, why do you want this data? And it was interesting. None of the public utilities said that. They just struggled to collect it in time. But it was a very aggressive email exchange that I had with them. And it could have been that person, it could have been, who knows, but there are certainly others that we'll try to reach out to.
Yeah, so I'm Carrie Woolman, I'm Light Water, local nonprofit. I couldn't help but notice that in the definition of access, there's a comment on having a home. So I was curious, if you all intended to extend the AWAS survey to understand the need and the access or lack of access for homeless populations or like undocumented folks or agricultural workers, and then in the international space, like some other.
Yeah, another great question. So I think for our next iteration, it will again be focused on homeowners and renters. So anybody who has a house, it's not because it's just a very different setup. It's a very different, it's just very different to try to understand the homeless situation. It's an entirely different, and not that we don't acknowledge it because it does come up, especially being in DC. There's been a lot of discussion of how to provide certain social services to the homeless population. It's reported on fairly frequently. I think we will flag it as something that we should figure out how to include, because I do think it's important. In the international context, it comes up a little bit more because we talk more about, I'm forgetting, but like the name of the communities without, like the communities outside of the city that are kind of pop up those cities. I think it's favelas in the Brazilian context, but those kinds of, is that?
Like peri-urban areas.
Yeah, the peri-urban community. So that comes up a lot more in terms of the policy and the lawmaking in terms of how to provide services to those communities. So we do deal with that in the international context. But yeah, great issue to focus on. Hi, yes, go ahead. Yeah.
That's me?
Yes.
Yeah. Paul from Catholic Relief Services. Sorry that we missed the start of this, but just looking at from kind of the practicality of the mobility, say, in, developing country, and you have a lot of people who aren't paying, and the risks of free rider and things. What have you looked at? What are potential options for utilities to be able to cover those costs, or how do they manage that in a way? What would be the best practice of being able to manage this in a way where you're not encouraging people not to pay, but trying to provide the incentives that they can pay what they can without creating, the problems that you're highlighting.
Yeah, from the surveys that we had, the issue is often that it's not that they don't want to pay, it's they literally don't have the money to do it. And that is not something that, that utilities can deal with either, in terms of there's not much to be done about that, right? It's just they don't have the financial resources, and they're choosing to either pay, they're choosing between paying for their rent, their electricity bill, their water bill, their car, all these other things that try to keep them afloat. One of the things we did find is that if you look at the order of expenses so one of the survey questions we asked was, how do you order your expenses? And typically it's rent and then electricity. I think electricity, because that's everything else in the house, right? That's your charger, that's your oven, it's everything else. And then water is typically second or third. But in terms of that, I think that's, some of it's just changing the rhetoric, because I think we're dealing with families that just don't have the money. It's not that they don't want to pay, and they're not a free rider. In the international context, it's a little bit different. We've worked in communities where that has come out as an issue, that for years and decades, they've never had to pay a water bill, so why would they start paying now? And that's a different context. Here, it's more like they just don't have the financial resources to pay. And it's a conversation that Luke and I have been having with different stakeholders, and it's actually a question that I will pose to you during the discussion is, if we don't have a water shutoff moratorium, what else do we have, right? What is another recourse for a utility when someone chooses not to pay? Let's say if there's a free rider contact, or even in the situation where they don't have the financial resources to pay. The last thing I would say is that, to me, it's also the state and federal government responsibility, and they have not stepped up. So if you look at funding for infrastructure, I mean, it's declined precipitously over the years, except for this year, right? It's the first time the federal government, at least in the United States, actually reinvested in our water and wastewater utilities, but not for rate assistance. So they're investing in the hard infrastructure, but not in the soft infrastructure. And this is what we've said, is that there's this huge investment, but if you can't pay for it, you're not going to actually benefit from it. So I think it's a question that we are thinking about and should continue to think about in terms of what other tools do a utility have if that's a set of circumstances they're faced with.
And I'll add, I mean, I don't think that we're suggesting that utilities should not have shutoffs at all. I mean, I think it'd be ideal if that was if we could do that. But really, it's just saying, how do we protect that lowest income population from those shutoffs and then still allow shutoffs for everyone who has the ability to pay but isn't paying? And so, I think part of it, particularly if you're dealing with a sort of building a new utility, building a new structure, is that if you can have sort of an idea as to what these best practices are from the outset, and you can build these in and make them clear and not opaque, the opposite, transparent, visible so that people are aware of them, I think that helps to do two things. First of all, it creates a greater sense of accountability, but it also creates a greater sense of trust. Where people are, they say they can see that the utility is making that effort to create the systems, create those protections. And I think it builds that relationship where people say, well, when I can pay, I will pay. And that's the kind of relationship, as opposed to one that's much more adversarial. You're going to come for me if I don't pay. So, I'm going to make sure that whatever money I have, you're not first on the list. And I think that, a lot of utility functioning, I think really works on that trust. Do you trust the water that you're getting? Do you trust that they're going to treat you well? And without policies and protections like this, that like what we're looking for here in our benchmark, you really can't build that relationship, and you're always going to be sort of fighting those battles. I think that's the implication from what we're seeing. And actually, one of the questions that Alexandra mentioned was we did ask people whether or not they have trust in their water and in their system. And some of the city results were a bit surprising, whether or not people actually have trust in their water. At least there was no sort of 100% no. I think there's some communities that we could look at where you might see something like that. I know in Detroit, there's a lot of animosity towards the DWSD, but in other cities, even 50% or 20% is pretty significant. 20% don't trust the water that's coming out of their faucets, and that's something, and that also has an impact on where their money is going. If you're buying bottled water, then you're going to say, well, that's where my water's coming from. Why should I pay my utility?
Actually, I would say the average of all the responses to the do you trust your water is 50%. 50% do, 50% don't. And that's an average across the city. It isn't entirely fair, but most of them fell within that 50 to 60% do or don't trust. So I think there's some significant trust in them.
Was there any follow-up on why that?
Not yet, yeah.
Yeah, we wanted to make sure that the burden on the respondents wasn't too high. So there's sort of a one-off survey, particularly for people who are coming in and looking for benefits. And obviously during COVID, it was a much more limited population as well. It did also go out through email and through phone, but we actually saw, if I remember correctly, we saw a greater response rate when the survey was presented by the CAA, the Community Action Agency, to people who were there in front of them.
Yeah.
And we were very, so I think it's reflective also to the fact that people have a lot of burdens on their time. So
And we did ask people if we could contact them again, so we can go back to them. And we haven't yet. Any other questions? Great.
I was just interested, wondering whether you're going to conduct a similar survey for sanitation and wastewater, and if you look at the laws regarding this.
So on the wastewater side, do you want to?
John, do you want to do it?
Go ahead.
Why do I want to do it? Well, I think for wastewater, a lot of times the bills are incorporated for at least in the United States for water and wastewater. So the water that comes in dictates how much you pay for wastewater. So a lot of the questions in terms of affordability and access, at least in the household, is going to be reflected in this. It's not so much, I think some of the questions about the trust of your wastewater system, things like that, we didn't necessarily get into that as much. We did focus more on water because I think that's, for a lot of households, that's where they see their money going. That's the product that they're receiving. But when it comes to the billing and the protections and a lot of the fees and things like that, that's reflected here. And obviously for shutoffs, the sewer sanitation is usually, our sewage systems are not usually shut off. So it's really just the water. So again, that's what's much more visible. That's what the actual action is. In terms of sanitation, I think, again, for sort of the question about undocumented and homeless and agricultural workers, I think if we were to do a follow-up, that would be something we would look at for access to sanitation in particular. Again, it's a significant issue, and but I think it's harder when it comes to households to collect that information.
One of the links between water and sanitation that we often forget, because of the work that we've been doing in El Paso, there was a situation with a mobile home park that was essentially denied access to water. So the person who was the private company actually who was providing the water to them the well stopped functioning and they tried to drill a different well, it didn't work, and so they were just like, okay, we're out of here. They just kind of left. And so for 2 to 3 months, they didn't have water, but they also didn't have sanitation. Because if you have a flush toilet, there's nothing to flush. And so they had significant, it wasn't just a water issue, it was a significant public health issue because they couldn't flush their toilets. And I think I even forget about that connection sometimes until the water is turned off in my apartment building and I no longer flush my toilet, but that's also one of the connections between the two. If you don't have water, you don't have sanitation. And I don't think we, despite a lot of the sanitation work we do abroad, I don't think we pulled that out enough in terms of the impact of sanitation, because there's also significant sanitation issues, like plumbing failures in the house happen a lot more frequently than we know about. There's some, so I think we need to pull that out more in the next iteration.
Was there a specific situation you were thinking about, or a specific,
Well, I just know that people that experience or don't have good sanitation all the time.
Mm.
Yeah, and I know it's not documented well. In surveys and whatnot, so. it would be good to add it to the survey or have a separate survey.
sure?
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, because you're absolutely right. We didn't pull that out enough in our survey either. It was really water focused, and again, we work on sanitation, so it was kind of interesting we didn't. So thank you for that. Yes.
I'm curious what examples more standardized metrics that are used to looking at, for example, for access using the safe and managed drinking water definition, and for looking at a lot of these questions around water insecurity using like the HY scale, which would have potentially made this data really comparable to other contexts. So you could compare across different contexts. Was there a reason you didn't kind of incorporate some of those more standardized questions?
Did you hear more of that question than I did?
I think so. So you said which metrics in particular?
Like for access using the definition on safely managed drinking water, and for water insecurity using the HY scale, which has been widely validated across countries and across different contexts, using that as an indicator. And
Yeah.
more, I guess, standardized metrics.
Yes. No, it's another good question. So for us, I've heard of the HY scale. A lot of this is more the law and policy focus and then the implementation of that. And so I think if we were to, like, we don't necessarily. You're referring.
No, I haven't.
So some of it is, there isn't a metric that focuses on law and policy. I think the metric that we have in terms of red, orange, green could be strengthened in terms of actually, like, for example, I pulled out that even though we indicated that a number of utilities had rate assistance programs, that they're not particularly effective rate assistance programs. So there's a lot more we could write down and actually create a metric of. I think we will in the future. So that it's more, I would say, detailed and a better representation of an actual grading structure for what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think also, for most households that in the cities where we were operating, they have, the access that they have is, they have a faucet, they have a tap in their home, it's connected to the drinking water system, the sanitation is connected to a sewerage system for the most part. So what those metrics don't necessarily reflect is when can those be taken away and what the legal protections are. So we're trying, I think, we're always trying to push the laws data and then the inclusion of laws data, which has not traditionally been done. How do you know whether or not there is a protection that prevents this from being taken away in some way? And that is, because that hasn't been done, we're sort of creating it from scratch. And I think that's, there's a real benefit to that. But it means that, a lot of the metrics that exist, it's kind of hard to tie them in. They can help provide a baseline for us to say, well, this is what this is the population level. But I think there's just some things that are missing still. So, but yes, but I think so it is a good case for thinking about the law and wars data, because we're trying to create that way to see the law as, as not just as an inflection point, but also as, something that really has a cause and effect. When you put these protections into place, here's what you can see. And so this is, I think this is not a one-off. We're going to go back to these communities and see how the laws change and really try to track this over time. That's the idea, is to create that insight. So hopefully over time we can start to show a little bit more science, at least with greater, not scientific certainty, legal certainty, that there is this cause and effect, that when you have these laws, that these protections mean something, that people don't lose access, that people are given the right notice, that they have the time to pay, things like that. So I think that's part of it.
Does that address your question? Okay, not. Want to make sure. Is there a question right there? Maybe we'll come back to. Yeah.
I'm curious when you talk about failure, specifically thinking about Jackson, Mississippi and the utility infrastructure issues there. Is there anything that the law indicates about those failures on the utility and when that pricing schedule can't really be followed because the user doesn't have any access?
Yeah. So, yes, well, there's a few things. So first of all, the equity component. So one of the issues I think largely fueling the Jackson, Mississippi, the Flint, Michigan issues is racism, right? You have largely Black communities that also are largely low income, and you have a significant underinvestment in those communities. So in Jackson, Mississippi, you see that, right? If you look at the amount of state funding in it, I mean, I think if you probably compared it to white communities, you probably see a significant difference. And I've seen some reporting on that, so that's not from my own observation, but that's from some of the reporting I've seen, initial reporting on trying to figure out. So equity has to be front and center, which is why we have it guiding all of the work. I think the second thing is that for decades, and I have actually, what's funny is I've been reading articles about Jackson, Mississippi for several years now. And so when this happened, I wasn't surprised. And frankly, I wish we had included them in our survey, but what you see is that you have failure to comply with the Clean Water Act or the Safe Drinking Water Act, and no one was doing anything about it. There wasn't an enforcement action brought. So part of it is an institutional failure. Part of it is a lack of transparency, that when there are these non-compliances, people don't really understand what that means, right? People don't understand where the money's going, how it's in non-compliance, how that's impacting them. They also don't understand how the underinvestment is fueling some of these issues. So there's a lot of it's transparency, a lot of it is dealing with just systemic racism, a lot of it is institutional, and the law can fix a lot of that. Again, a lot of that law has to be implemented. I mean, racism, again, that's difficult. You actually have to abide by the laws that you put in place for equal protection and so on and so forth. But yes, there's a lot that the law could have done to do that. Some of it's reporting, right? Even having to report certain information out to your customers. Like, for example, I sit on the National Drinking Water Advisory Council, and we had this whole panel discussion or this series of discussions about how to improve the consumer confidence report. So has anyone ever received, if you live in the United States, have you received a document from your drinking water provider saying this is how the last year went? If you have, that's right. Some of it is not particularly understandable or comprehensible. Like if you really want to understand if you're drinking water safe, it's not super understandable. So that's what we were talking about, like how to make that more understandable and usable from a consumer. And it has nothing to do with education level. It literally just has to do with understanding very difficult to understand concepts. So some of that, again, transparency, I would say, is another issue that could also be dealt with.
Yeah, but I think there's also, I mean, part of it is that legal infrastructure in the United States is a little bit weaker. I mean, we don't, when it comes to water, we just haven't necessarily, we've sort of done a very good job of the minutia, but not really the big sort of underlying principles. There's no constitutional right to water. And there are a number of courts that said there's no constitutional right to water, which means, you know, it could be taken away from you. You don't, there's no guaranteed access, and there's no necessarily, and as a result, there's not necessarily a guaranteed or requirement that the funding be there to provide it. And I think that, you know, so there are some bigger issues in the law that prevent some of that allow some of these things to fester and grow and don't necessarily provide a legal basis for real challenges that communities can bring to try and change the behavior. And it's not necessarily about punishing, you know, Jackson, Mississippi, you know, they have I mean, besides the racism issues, I think there's also just general funding issues and economic issues. But there needs to be something that creates that mandate that at some level, because the money has to come from somewhere. I mean, at a certain point, you're saying, we're not investing in our water systems, people are going to die. And, you know, at a certain point, we're saying that's acceptable to us if we don't actually take this action, if we don't make it some sort of legal mandate. And that's a problem in this country. That's a problem. That's something we should be ashamed of. It is something that we should be ashamed of, that we don't protect that. So, but I think that's also, it means that there isn't the same foothold for litigants, for community members, for people who are actually being harmed to go into court and try to create some sort of change because they don't have a claim. There's no legal basis. It's just gone. They just don't win. And so a lot of what you do see, where you are seeing footholds now, is where you have civil rights issues, where there's actually disparate treatment between whites and blacks and people of color in general. And that's what's being explored in Cleveland and in Detroit, in part, those disparate practices. But that foothold is very tenuous, and it hasn't yielded results. Results isn't the right word. It hasn't changed the game yet. And it's unclear as to how long that's going to take. And then obviously there's appeals. So, I mean, how long will it be? And so I think that's a bigger issue, is that we don't have those underlying, it's not that the communities that these laws will create money, right? But at least it will sort of say there is responsibility and help to drive some of that decision making, which is happening.
And just to add a piece that actually kind of relates to what Paul asked about earlier, is that if your utility fails to comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act or the Clean Water Act, if you're a wastewater treatment provider, what is the penalty, right? So if you're EPA, you issue civil penalties against a wastewater or a drinking water provider. Well, who pays those civil penalties? It's the consumer, right? It's the ratepayer who's suffering from not having compliant, their services in compliance, and now you're punishing them again. I mean, it's a really backwards system. So there's no system to even punish a utility, right? And that would be the other question that kind of, to me, goes in tandem with what Paul was asking. Like, there's one thing about how can the utilities hold people accountable. Well, how can we hold the utilities accountable? Because I would argue in many instances, there's no accountability between the two. And transparency is one of the best ways that I think that's the biggest tool we have. The more transparent you make their operations, the better. So a lot of this stuff with Jackson and Flint, it would have come out sooner, and you could have seen it and maybe prevented some of it if it was just more transparent.
Yeah.
But that to me is that paired question with what Paul was asking earlier.
Yeah, and it is even reflected in sort of what is happening in Detroit right now. They're rolling out a very good looking affordability program. I mean, there's some smaller issues, and certainly how they're dealing with renters and the amount of water they're providing each household. There are a lot of issues, but at its core, it does seem to be trying to prevent shutoffs of low-income households, which is a great start. It's something that they have resisted and used shutoffs to try to prevent. And there's been a lot of issues there. But the program is being funded because there's money from the federal government, from the LIHWAP program that they're able to get if they can get people to sign up, and from sort of this money is from the county and from the water authority. There's a sort of a set amount that they get for rate assistance in Detroit, because Detroit is creating most of the water for the region, and they also charge less to everyone except for Detroiters, which is a great irony. But after the pilot program which they're putting in place, if they don't get more money, they're not going to be able to fund it. The only way they're going to be able to fund it is to raise rates across the board. And same thing with clearing arrearages. This is what they say time. If we clear the arrearages and we don't get the money, at the end of the day, all these bad debts are just going to go right back into the bills. So there's a circularity to the issue as well. So it's almost like the issues aren't just in the communities, they're also at the utility level. The utility doesn't have enough money to fund these programs sometimes. And, the only way they can do it is by raising rates, and that creates more problems with the community. So it's just sort of a back and forth, and there needs to be sort of an externality that changes that. And we're hoping, the federal government or the state government should be it, ideally, but.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about learning more about the international context that you apply to school. Like, have you modified it anyway, or are there only certain, you apply in only certain contexts when the government is providing water?
Yeah, so funny enough, the international benchmark that we developed actually came first. If it's in public. So what happened is we were creating something called the renewal platform. And as part of that, it captured all this information about law and policy that governs national water laws. Essentially, the focus was national water laws and national water security laws. So we looked at environmental laws, all kinds of laws, and it was essentially an assessment of what is the water security law status in these countries. It was a really unwieldy, it's a great idea, but it's very unwieldy and hard to kind of access. It's like a very large essay on a website that we have. So we used that to analyze country law. So we used it, and people do use it. We were trying to think of a more accessible way. So we created a benchmark, And as we were working with countries, we noticed that we kept talking about the same thing. So when we were talking to the government of South Sudan or even of El Salvador, actually it was really El Salvador that prompted it. I was saying, look, this should be in your law, this should be in your law, this should be in your law. And I was like, this is what I need to write out. So we created this benchmark, and that's what we've used because it reflects the advice that we provide to national governments. So I say that as a long way of saying this came about as a result of that work. They look very different because the context was very different that we were coming from. So this, we kind of came from a different report from their Maryland report. So they're different insofar as that it already focuses a lot, it's higher level in many respects. And it also focuses on the entire water security picture. So like the physical access, economic access, it focuses on all of that, but it's higher level. So it's less detailed because we're thinking about it in what should be in a national water law rather than what should be all of the things that should exist to protect your water. So this is actually more detailed right now, and then that will become more detailed over time.
Yeah, I would say it's almost like we would have the bigger sort of legal protections would be
Yeah.
built into the international benchmark now, with a lot of the more granular things that we see that we're looking for in the laws written. And in this would be sort of the next step would be the sort of how do you implement that more directly. So you'd have like the protection again, no water shutoffs against low income households and proper notice and opportunities to pay. That would be built in at the higher legal level, and then the smaller, like how many days for notice, do you provide payment plans? That would be more in the implementation. So, but first, you sort of like we have the opportunity in some ways that we don't have in this country to address things at a much more systemic level, and that at the international level, because some of the water laws are, a lot of water laws that we look at, come from a long time ago.
And we get into those details when we talk with our partners, but we don't, it's not reflected in the benchmark yet. But like another example that will wind up in this is you have a system for fairly and equitably allocating water rights to people. So that's in our international benchmark. Do you have a system for managing water quality? So the water quality of your rivers and lakes. Do you have a system for managing your drinking water quality, your wastewater? And then there's more specific questions, but it's a higher level, like infrastructure, kind of legal infrastructure benchmark.
So do you have a plan to do household surveys in international context?
What's that?
Do you have a plan to do household surveys in international context or just the information?
Yeah, so we do a lot of field work, so it's a different kind of questionnaire process. So we do a lot of field work with like governmental entities and CSOs, very similarly to here, like the corollary is the Community Action Agency is the CSO in the US. And so we interview those institutions. We have not, I would say, surveyed households in particular, but it certainly could be part of, we get that information through the CSO. Whereas the CAAs here do less of that. So even though it's kind of an interesting context, I feel like the CSOs internationally work a lot more directly with households sometimes, depending on the CSO. In the US, the CAAs, the community action agencies, even though they're providing social services to households, so they have a lot of interaction with households. And they actually have a lot of understanding of all the problems that a household faces, like all the social services they need. They don't ask the kinds of questions we do because that's not their job. They're just trying to get social service benefits out the door. So it's just an interesting similarities and differences between the two. But yeah. Any other questions, comments? So we have 15 minutes. I have a series of questions that we're definitely not going to get through. But there's one that I thought would be kind of fun to give everybody maybe 7 minutes to talk about. We can kind of just quickly divide you into groups, but essentially, I'm just going to focus on the first two. And that would be if there were 3 rights that you would want to create in the law, what would those rights be and how would you define them? So thinking about the definition part, right? Because when we talk about the human right to water and sanitation, it's a very philosophical, kind of elusive concept, right? It doesn't have a tremendous amount of meaning, which is why we focus more on this idea of access than the human right to water. So what are those rights that you would want to see in the law? What is a right that you think you should have as a citizen resident of your country? And then how would you define those rights? So maybe 2, you can choose your top 1 or your top 2 based on the amount of time, but I'll give you maybe until the 7 minutes. We're 9:46, so maybe until 9. So if you want to split into the 2 sides of your room, this side, that side. It's not designed to have this conversation, but I'm like really struggling to breathe. It's amazing.
Yeah, I don't-
I feel like my lungs would be stronger by now. How am I gonna teach this semester?
You have to get used to it. Talk slow. Let's talk slow.
Is do the,
Have to.
as I play with the fish my breath.
I mean, it's better.
Also, you know what's actually funny? This actually hurts my back. My back is killing me. I know, right? Don't get me like that.
Um, Yeah, interesting.
Okay, so I know that wasn't
We're still able to find.
wasn't a lot of time. Sorry to cut you guys off if you're having conversations.
Hopefully you solved all the.
You guys had so many great questions to begin with that we got to focus more on that. So in the 6 or 7 minutes that you've had, I'm sure you've resolved all of the issues and developed all of the rights. So why don't we start with this side? What were some of the rights that came up in your conversations? If you could prioritize two, let's say even, what were the two rights that really stood out to you?
We talked about clean water, defining that and that the public should have a right to know whether it's clean or not, whether that's reports from the utility or just annual monthly testing.
Okay, that's great. So a right to know. Specifically about the quality of water, but there are broader right to know set that some of these water data acts that I was mentioning before are actually right to know. Some people refer to them as right to know acts. So that's a great right. Any other rights that were talked about in this context or in this side?
I'm talking about like water quality, so water quantities and how they live in that for basic needs.
Okay, good. Anything else that came up?
Anything that was discussed and rejected?
Actually, yeah, that's a good point. Okay, awesome. How about on this side, rights that you would prioritize?
I feel like those were also the two main things that we talked about was information and education, and then availability and it being provided at a certain quantity for basic.
Okay, so I want to unpack one thing and then I'll come back to you. So the right, so you also said right to know and education as well.
Yeah.
So why the right to know? Why is that so important for you? Why did both of you guys, why do you think that came up? What is that? What is fueling that? Yeah, Paul.
There's an uncertainty of the quality of water. And a lot of people who are very poor are still buying bottled water because they don't trust the water. And partly it's because some of these big problems that in Detroit and others where people find out late that the quality of water is good. So it's created so much doubt about the ability to drink tap water. So if you have a right to know your water quality regularly, it can build up people's confidence that, on 98% of the water in the country is fine every day. And so just creating that confidence that people can consume that water would, I think, go a long way.
Yeah.
Spending their water on the tap water rather than all of water.
Well, and something you were saying also, there's this interesting idea of having like a right to know information and then having the law also have reporting requirements, right? Because there are reporting requirements, but it's not the same as a right to know certain information. So I think there's something there. Yeah.
A little bit like I found that it's not one thing like getting a water quality report, but that it's like disseminate in a way that people.
Right.
Because I think a lot of us in this room would have the privilege of like understanding what some of those things mean, but one of those people not. And then on top of that, like right to know, like we should know what's in the water as well. So people are paying install that adverse risk because they're getting bottled water, which is actually just municipal water supply without any filtration. Any treatment. That's another thing that.
Right. Yeah, and the bottled water aspect is also interesting because that's governed by the FDA, not the EPA. So their quality is actually lower oftentimes. And then the education piece, you said education as well, which I think is interesting, because that also, in terms of having a right to information, you also have to educate people so they understand the information that they're receiving. So thinking about, and also how early, right? Like to me, that should be in schools, and that's not necessarily, I mean, you could legislate, right? You could legislate education on this, actually. And I do think that's critical because if you have an informed citizen, like think about how informed we are about these issues, imagine if everyone was like, this, right? We fix these issues much faster because it would be a priority. Because the dangers that await, but yeah.
That's what you said, right of education, like, was it just the right to have the information, or was there something else built into that? Or no, for the group in general, the right of knowledge and education, if I remember. Was there something more built into that, like accessibility of the information, or is there, what is required for informed citizenry?
Well, okay, as an example from subsidence areas in Texas, right?
Mhm.
They do something called, or, they have a whole conservation program, right, to conserve water. They teach it at third and fourth grade. Like, and they do a whole couple weeks of like, here's the education, they educate kids and take it home. They take home kids to explain to the parents, like, why do we need to conserve water in, Houston region? Because overuse is causing flooding and all kinds of issues. And so, like, even education programs talk about, like water quality or like, ways to say, yeah, actually your water is, like, bottled water isn't necessarily better than this, or like, here's what you can learn from your utility. I don't know, I feel like.
Hmm.
I mean, this can only target a very certain demographic that have kids in school or people with kids in schools, but I think it has been fairly successful, my understanding, within the Houston context.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I'd never heard about a program like that. So that's really, I know it's a lot of, for like uptake on hygiene. There's a lot of push in the Kenya for similar programs, like
Yeah, so
bringing it home from
Utilities
school.
pay, so they pay into the program,
Hmm.
which then gives them legal credits when it comes to subsidence. And so there's
Hmm.
lots of money, because they've made this like banking system for overuse.
Hmm.
But they get credits by funding this program that does education.
Well, I don't want to hold you over, so thank you so much for all of your thoughts and for attending, and if you have any questions, feel free to stop and we're happy to chat, so thank you so much.